Hey, what's up guys? Ryan here from ExtremeTerrain, and today I'm here with a rough country 3.5-inch suspension lift kit with control arm drop brackets fitting your 2007 to 2018 two-door Wrangler JK. Now of course it's going to be for the JK owner that's looking for a fully loaded kit to lift their Wrangler without breaking the bank or hurting their wallet. Now rough country caters to those off-roading enthusiasts that are on a budget, and they stick to that motto of getting you lifted for less, providing the best quality of course for the price. Rough Country has pretty much thought of everything with this kit, even brackets to level out those control arms. Now with this kit, you're getting 3.5 inches of lift, which is going to give you plenty of ground clearance to conquer most of those trails and of course stuff some 35s under your Jeep. Now the nice thing about this particular lift kit is it's going to include a ton of parts that are not really included in other kits for the price that it's coming in at. Now lift kits are going to come in all different variations, and they're going to range from anywhere from a couple $100 all the way up to a couple $1,000. What's going to set Rough Country apart from the rest is going to be the amount of product that you're going to get for the price. Now you're getting everything that you need to lift your Wrangler up, set those angles back into spec. Now, as far as price goes, this kit is coming in right around $530, which I think is a great option considering all the parts that you get with this kit to get your vehicle uplifted and back on the road ready to hit those trails. Now a lift kit is going to increase your Jeep's capability. You're going to get additional ground clearance, getting that vulnerable drivetrain up and off the ground, and also you're going to get that aggressive taller stance over that stock factory look. One of the nice things that I like about this kit is going to be those control arm relocation brackets. Rather than spending extra money on longer adjustable control arms, which are really just going to push that axle forward, these brackets are going to not only flatten out the control arm angle, and this is going to provide optimal geometry and result in better handling. Now there is some drilling required with this kit, but it's all pretty straightforward, and I show you exactly how to do that in this video. As far as installation goes, we are working on the Jeep. We're completely disassembling the suspension, so I'm going to give this a 3 out of 3 wrenches on the difficulty meter. I would expect this to take about 5 hours or an afternoon, and I would definitely recommend having a friend there to help. So with that being said, let's hop into our install. Tools that we used for this install: a bungee cord, pry bars, a 3/8 drill bit, a 13/32 drill bit, a drill, 3/8 drive impact, 21mm wrench, 19mm wrench, 18mm wrench, 16mm wrench, 14, 11, and a 10mm wrench. A prying tool, a stick magnet, a crayon, safety glasses, tape measure, pitman arm puller, an adjustable wrench, a torque wrench that goes up to 150 foot-pounds, 3/8 drive ratchet, 1/2-inch drive ratchet, 1/4-inch drive ratchet, pliers. We used a Phillips head screwdriver to align some holes, socket extensions, both 3/8 and 1/2-inch, 1/2-inch drive impact, 33mm socket, 22mm socket, 21, 19, 18, 15, 16, 14, 11, and 10mm sockets, a hammer, and a dead blow hammer. Other tools you may want to use: a pole jack or jack stands and a floor jack, as well as maybe a ratchet strap. All right guys, so we're going to start on the front of the Jeep, and of course first thing you want to do, you want to put your Jeep up in the air. Now as you can see, I have my Jeep up on a lift. You don't have to necessarily do it on a lift, but if you have access to one, of course it's going to make it a lot easier. You can do this on the ground. What you want to do is jack the Jeep up from the axle, and that way you can support the frame rails with some jack stands, because we need to lower the axle down once we disconnect all this suspension. So the first thing I'm going to do, I'm going to take my trusty pole jacks, I'm going to support the axle on both ends, and then we'll start taking stuff apart. So the next thing we're going to do, we're going to take our drive shaft out. Our exhaust over here is actually going to limit the amount that this axle can drop. So what we want to do is we want to take these 4 bolts out of this flange. That way we can hang it up out of the way. What you want to do is you want to mark this. That way when we put it back in, it's going to go back in the same exact way. So I'm just going to take a crayon or a crown, whatever you want to call it. And I'm just going to mark both of these flanges right here. And we'll take an 18mm on an impact. We'll take all 4 of these bolts out. Then we'll probably take a bungee and just strap it up there out of the way. You can take your bungee cord and you can hang it out of the way. So, try to find a good spot under here. Keep in mind that we have to take these control arms off as well, so you want to hang this in a good spot where it's actually not going to be in the way of getting those control arms off. All right, so next we're gonna come back out front because we have a ton of stuff that we need to disassemble on the front. Gotta get this track bar out, our sway bar end links, and of course our drag link because we have a brand new pitman arm that we need to install. So first thing we're gonna do, we're gonna take that track bar bolt out and then we'll get started on taking those sway bar end links out. So to take this track bar bolt out, you need a 21mm socket on an extension. There is a flag nut on the back, so you don't need a tool for that. Now to get these sway bar end links off, you're gonna need an 18mm socket and a wrench for the bottom, and you'll need an 18mm for the top and a 19 to grab onto this backside right here, that way it doesn't spin. So we're gonna take the bottom off. We gotta take these links completely off because we're actually gonna put the rears on the front, and we have brand new ones for the rear. Now we do wanna save this bottom hardware because we're gonna be reusing this, so make sure that you put that in a safe spot. We'll do the same thing to the other side. So the next thing we're gonna do, we're gonna disconnect our drag link from our pitman arm because like I said, we have to take this pitman arm off. We have a brand new one to swap in. So you're gonna need a 21mm wrench, or you can use a 13/16 up here to get this nut off. What we're gonna do is just crack this free. Now this arm is gonna want to move when you go to crack it free, so you might wanna just take a hammer or just pound the end of this wrench just to get it to crack free. Once it does, you should be able to get it off. However, you can't really get a socket or anything in there. So we're just gonna have to take our time getting this off. So once you get that nut off, what we're gonna do, you wanna get that nut completely off, and then we're gonna put it back on about a thread or two. You don't wanna put it on too far because we don't want it to get stuck or spin. After that, we're gonna get a hammer and we're gonna smack this free up this joint. So all you wanna do is we wanna smack the pitman arm, that way we can free up the tie rod that's in the end of that. And you don't wanna hit the steering box too hard because you can mess up the gears in it, but it's okay to just do it to get this free. So what we're gonna do, I'm actually gonna stick a hammer on the back side. I'm gonna smack both of these at the same time, and that's gonna free it up. All right, so the reason we leave the nut on there, of course, is when this breaks free, that way it doesn't drop down and swing around. And of course, you can use a pickle fork, but if you use a pickle fork, you'll most likely mess this boot up. You'll have to get another boot. That's why I'm using hammers. So again, once you free that up, we're just gonna lift that up a little bit, take that nut off, drop it down, put the nut back on so we don't lose it. So next thing we're gonna do, we're gonna come over to the side of our frame. Inside the wheel well, just behind our shock, we have these brake line brackets that we need to take off, and we have drop brackets that we're gonna reinstall. You're gonna have one bolt right here, that's gonna be a 10mm socket to get that out. We're gonna have another one on the axle, which I'll show you in just a second. So like I said, the next one we're gonna disconnect is gonna be right here on the axle behind our shock at the bottom. You're gonna use a 10mm socket to get that bolt out. Now you're not gonna be able to get this bracket out because our shock's in the way, so while we're here, we're gonna go ahead and take our shock out. Now for the bottom shock bolt, we're gonna use an 18mm wrench and an 18mm socket, and you wanna save that hardware. So after we get the bottom out, the next thing we're gonna do is get the top out. Now you're gonna see that this battery tray, it's actually gonna go all the way across, and that is going to keep you from getting any sort of tool inside of there. So what you can do is just grab this edge with a pair of pliers, and all we're gonna do is just break this off. That way we can free this little hole up. Don't worry, it's not a structural part of the Jeep, so it doesn't really make a huge difference. All right, so you need a 16mm wrench for the bottom to hold this shock still, and then a 16mm wrench for the top. Most likely you want to get a ratcheting wrench because it's going to make it a lot faster, and you can't get a socket in there. So So once you get that nut all the way off, you can pull the shock all the way out. Now there is going to be a bushing and a washer up here, so you want to make sure that you knock that out of there because we have brand new stuff to install. So then you can go over to the other side and get that other shock out. Now you're going to see on the driver's side, you're not going to have that issue with that battery box being there. You can just go ahead and just take that thing out. Same thing, 16mm wrench on the bottom, 16 on the top. Same thing, once you get that top nut off, we're going to wiggle this shock out. You're going to make sure that you pull that bushing and that washer out of the top. So at this point in time, we're going to lower the axle. We have everything disconnected that we need to disconnect. We're going to go ahead and lower this down. We're going to get these springs out. Now there's two things you want to make sure. Last thing we have to do, you have to pull that axle vent tube off. That's going to be just a tube going into the axle, this center section right here. That's going to slide right off. And since we got those shocks off, you want to make sure that you get those brackets out of the axle for those brake lines and that ABS. That way we don't drag those and rip any of those lines. I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to lift this vehicle up on the lift. That's going to free up those springs and then we'll pull them out. So to get these springs out, just lift up on the bottom, pull towards the front, and we just pull that spring out. So now that we have the axle stripped down, the springs are out, the next thing we're going to start working on is getting these control arms out. We have to loosen up and take out the top and lower control arms. That way we can put these drop brackets over here on the frame side. What we're going to do, we're going to loosen up these bolts down here on the axle. You're going to need a 21mm socket and a 21mm wrench, or another socket for this bottom bolt. So next we're going to move on to the upper control arm, 18mm and an 18mm. We'll take this bolt most likely all the way out. So next we're going to go to the top of our control arm where it's mounted to the frame. You're going to have to take the shield off to access the bolt. The shield's going to be held on by two bolts. We'll use a 10mm socket to get both those bolts out. There's going to be one down here, and there's going to be one all the way back up here on the back side. So after you get that shield off, we're going to take this bolt all the way out. Now there is a flag nut on the back side, right inside of here. So we're just going to use an 18mm socket to get this bolt out. So after you get that top control arm out, next we're going to do, we're going to go to the back of this control arm where it meets the frame, the lower control arm. We're actually going to take this bolt all the way out. So we're going to use a 21mm socket and a wrench to get that out. Going to make sure that you keep all these bolts in order, so if you have to put them back in the control arm, just to keep an eye on them of exactly where they are, that would be a good idea. All right guys, so before we get started with installing these new parts, and since we have some of these stock parts out, I put them on the table. I have everything lined up pretty much that comes in this kit. And what I want to do before we get started, I just want to go over what all these pieces are and what they exactly do, and of course what they are made of. Now the first thing I want to talk about is the springs. Now the springs are going to be what gives you your height in your vehicle. So these are going to give you the height, and the first thing you're going to notice, besides them being taller than the factory ones, is the coil windings. Now the coil windings are not only closer together, but they're also a lot thicker. That's going to give you a higher spring rate. If you go adding larger, heavier aftermarket bumpers and a winch up front, that's going to hold up and keep that distance a little bit better than that factory spring. Now, of course, to dampen these springs so you don't go bouncing around, that's going to be the shocks. Now, Rough Country includes these N3.0 shocks, or the N3 shocks, and these are actually based off of the platform of the N2, the N.2, and these are a nitrogen-charged shocks. Now, your factory shock is going to be a hydraulic shock, and hydraulic shocks are great for giving you that great on-road driving experience, but one of the problems with a hydraulic shock is going to be when you're off-roading with them. They're going to tend to heat up really fast, and they're going to create cavitation inside because of that hydraulic fluid. This is going to result in shock fade. So they're not only going to get very hot, but of course they're going to fade. You're going to lose that dampening effect. They're very nice for on-road. They're going to give you great ride quality. However, if you're really looking to do off-roading, you want something that's going to be a little more heavy duty, you want a nitrogen shock. Nitrogen shocks are geared more for the off-road because they're nitrogen filled. They're not going to have that cavitation, you're not gonna have that heat buildup, and of course you're not gonna have that shock fade when you're really working them hard on the trail. Now these have a 54mm shock body that's much larger than the factory one, and inside is a 35mm piston. These are gonna have great dampening effect. They are gonna ride a little stiffer on road, but they're gonna perform great off-road. Now these have a hardened shaft that's chrome plated, and this is an 18mm shaft. So this is gonna make this a very strong shock, and it's gonna keep it from bending under extreme pressures and loads. It's chrome plated, and that's gonna protect this seal inside of there. That way, if you do get any dirt on that, since this doesn't have a cover like your factory one, that's gonna keep that from damaging any internals, messing up that seal, and losing that nitrogen charge. Now moving down the line, we're gonna get a front track bar relocation bracket and a rear track bar relocation bracket. Now what these are gonna do, since we are pushing that axle down, we're changing the angle of our track bar, and these are actually gonna raise that track bar back up a little bit, and that's going to level that out a little bit. It's gonna give you a little bit better of a roll center and keep that anti-roll to a minimum. Now since we are raising the track bar back up, we're also changing the steering angles, and this is gonna come with a drop pitman arm. So that's gonna level that out a little bit, and that's gonna reduce that bump steer somewhat. Now, since this kit, of course, putting a lift kit, you're gonna be able to fit larger tires in there, and you don't want those tires to run into your fenders. So Rough Country is gonna give you a front bump stop to go on the axle and a rear bump stop as well. This is for moments in extreme articulation. When you are off-roading, that's gonna keep those tires from coming up, hitting that fender, and causing damage. Now, one of the nice cost-efficient things that Rough Country does, and most lift kits are going to do for you, what they're doing is they're ditching the front sway bar links. They are tiny little links, and we're gonna need longer ones for the front since we are adding a taller spring in there. So we take the rear sway bar links, we're gonna swap them up to the front, and Rough Country is actually gonna give you brand new ones for the rear. Now, another main issue with adding a lift kit, depending on the size, is gonna be that control arm angle. So up front, you're gonna raise the body up, you're gonna create a sharp angle for your control arms, and that's gonna result in a really rough ride. So Rough Country is going to give you a control arm drop racket setup for the front, and what that's gonna do is gonna drop your control arms just a little bit on the back end, level them out, and that's gonna give you better driving characteristics and drivability when you're going down the road. Now on the rear, when we're pushing that axle away, since we have fixed control arms, what it's gonna do is it's actually gonna roll the axle a little bit, and this is gonna cause some curvature in your springs. So Rough Country is going to give you these coil spring correction plates. These are actually gonna sit on the axle, and they're gonna give that little bit of tilt, and that's gonna allow that spring to sit a little bit more straight up and down and not get that weird coil curve, which is gonna result in, once again, bad driving characteristics. Now overall, Rough Country has pretty much thought about everything that you're gonna need for this kit to get you up, lifted, and back on the road. One thing that they don't bring in this kit and don't provide you with, but they do offer, that you can find it on our website, is going to be exhaust spacers. Now, for 2012 and up models, what you're gonna have an issue with is those oversized drive shafts. So the oversized front drive shaft has a rubber boot right in the middle, and we have a crossover extension pipe for our exhaust. So when adding a lift or pushing that axle down further, we're getting that drive shaft closer to that exhaust, and we're actually getting that rubber boot a little too close to the exhaust. If you are mall crawling, or if you're just daily driving this thing, honestly, it's not really something that you would need to look into. It is recommended. I do recommend you installing that. But if you're just doing daily driving, honestly, it's not really a huge issue that you need to worry about. Now, these are relatively affordable. You can find them on our site for about $30. And if you want to go the more expensive route, you can get aftermarket drive shafts that are going to be much smaller in diameter, and you can swap those in. That's really not going to have an issue with that exhaust crossover. So that's pretty much everything that I wanted to say. So what we're going to do, we're going to get this table out of here. We're going to start installing these parts, and I'm going to show you exactly how to do that right now. All right, so we're going to start on the passenger side since we already have these control arms out. What we're going to be doing is installing these drop brackets. Now, as far as hardware goes, you're going to get hardware out of bag 1106, bag 2, and that's going to be for these control arm drop brackets. You're going to have a larger bolt and a smaller bolt, and the first bracket that we're going to install is going to be the outer bracket, and this is going to be 131 for the passenger side. So what we're going to do, we're going to start with this top hole here, and you're actually going to get a spacer. So this is going to be a 3/4 inch OD, outside diameter spacer. So we're gonna slide this bracket up into here. We're actually gonna put this spacer inside of this, and then we'll install a bolt through the outside towards the inside, put a nut on it. So right now what I'm gonna do, I'm gonna hold this up here, and I'm gonna try to get this spacer in here. Now you might need to bend these tabs apart a little bit so you can fit this stuff in. All right, so we have that pretty much in place. Next thing we're gonna do, we're gonna take our 12mm by 90mm bolt. This is gonna be one of the skinnier bolts that they give you. You're gonna put a flat washer on the bolt head, and we're actually gonna go through our frame rail. There's a big hole out here, We're gonna go through the frame rail and then through that new bracket and sleeve. Now to get this bolt in, what I'm gonna do, I'm just gonna take a 19mm socket, I'm gonna put it on an extension, and I'm actually just gonna fish it through this hole and try to get it to come out the other side. If you have to, once you have the holes lined up, you can take a hammer. We'll just push that bolt all the way through and out the other side. So we're gonna get this second bolt in here, down here. What we're gonna do, same thing, we wanna line those holes up. Now we're gonna have the larger bolt that comes with the kit, 14mm by 110mm. We're gonna put a flat washer on the head. This is gonna go through the outside, and also we have a 7/8 OD outside diameter sleeve that we need to get up inside of there. So same thing, you might have to bend these brackets out just a little bit, but also you might get away with just ever so gently tapping it into place. Now, if you really have to hit it, you're probably gonna scratch the powder coat, so I would recommend just bending the brackets apart a little bit. That way you won't have to mess that finish up. Now, before we get any of these nuts installed, we're gonna install our inner bracket on this passenger side. Passenger side inner bracket is going to be 133 at the end of this little tag, and you're gonna have this slot right here. This slot's going to be for this edge. So what we're gonna do is just gently slide it over both of these bolts. Now we can install the nuts. So the top one's gonna have a flange nut. So we don't need a washer for that. Bottom one is gonna have a different type of nut. It's not gonna have a flange on it, so we're gonna get a washer for that. So we're just gonna put that washer on and then screw that nut on. Now at this point in time, we can go ahead and tighten these brackets up. So now what we're gonna do is we're just gonna take some of the slack out of these bolts. So I'm gonna use a 22mm socket and an adjustable wrench so that I can just snug these up. Now for the top, we're gonna use a 19mm socket or an extension going through the frame rail. We use a 19mm wrench on the other side. We want to leave these a little loose, that way we can get these other bolts through, and then once we get the control arms back in, we'll go ahead and tighten everything down. So now that we have these brackets in, they're still a little loose, we're going to go and start by installing our upper control arm. We're going to use the factory hardware for where it bolts to the axle. We'll go ahead and get that bolt back in. Rough Country provides us with brand new hardware for our brackets. So we're going to use that same bolt that we used for the upper control arm mount, that 12mm by 90mm. Same thing, washer on the bolt head. And we're actually gonna have to push our axle forward to get these bolt holes to line up. Whole purpose of these brackets are not only to recenter our axle front to back, but to drop our control arms down and level out. And on the back side, we'll put that flange nut on there. And after that, same thing, we'll get our lower control arm in. So the next thing we're gonna do, we're gonna swing our lower control arm back up into this mount. We actually have brand new hardware from Rough Country. So we're gonna get a cam bolt in a kit. You're gonna have two separate bags. They're gonna have a flat spot on there. What you're gonna do is slide one of those cam washers on, and then you'll go through both sides of this bracket. So we'll swing this control arm up, put that all the way through just like that. On the other side, we're gonna do the same thing, slide that cam washer on, and then put this nut on. This is actually pretty nice because now you actually have some adjustability as far as your pinion angle goes. So at this point in time, what we're gonna do is we're gonna tighten up our brackets all the way, and then we're gonna actually take the slack out of our control arm bolts. We don't wanna torque our control arm bolts right now because you actually wanna torque them when they're on the ground. That way this bushing inside of here is relaxed at ride height. So we're gonna take that 22mm and our adjustable wrench, and we'll tighten up this big bolt back here. Then we'll take our 19mm with an extension, go through the frame on the outside, 19mm wrench, we'll tighten up this top bolt. Just a little bit so it stays in place. So for this upper one right here, we're gonna use a 19 and a 19. We just wanna snug it up, but we don't wanna torque it yet. All right guys, so we're gonna go over to the other side and we're gonna do that same exact thing. We're gonna pull this heat shield off, take these control arms out, put the drop brackets in, and then put everything back together. So the next thing we're going to be doing is installing our coil springs. Before we get our coil springs installed, we have a bump stop that we need to install on the axle. So we will be marking and drilling a hole directly in the center of this spring pad right here. Once we mark and drill the hole, most likely we're going to install this with the coil spring. That way we get enough drop and we don't have to fight that spring getting up and over top of this bump stop when we get it in. So I'm gonna go get some tools and we'll come back and drill that hole. So of course we're gonna grab a pair of gloves, some safety glasses. What you wanna do is just set that bump stop right there. And we wanna center it as best as possible. And you can actually mark a hole with a pen, crayon, whatever you wanna do. I'm actually gonna hold this in place, drop the drill bit down, and then we'll start a mark. So now that we got our mark, we're gonna pull that bump stop off, we're gonna drill all the way through. So to drill that hole, what we're gonna use is a drill and a 3/8 drill bit, and we wanna go all the way through that axle. So now that we have the hole drilled, the next thing we're gonna do is actually bolt this bump stop on. Now, the reason I'm gonna bolt it on and then put the spring in, I have plenty of drop that I can actually get this spring over top. Now, if you don't have enough drop, what you wanna do is you wanna put this up inside of the spring and then just put that whole assembly on and bolt it down. Now, as far as hardware goes, you're gonna use the hardware from bag 1609, bag 7. And that's gonna be this long bolt. You're gonna put a flat washer that is provided with that kit, and it's gonna drop down through this spacer, and on the bottom, we're gonna use this gold flange nut. So I'm actually gonna use a magnet to hold this up against the stud. That way I can get it started. If I got that started, I'm gonna go grab some tools and then we'll get that tightened down. Tighten these up, what I'm gonna do, I'm gonna use a 14mm socket and a wrench. I'm gonna go underneath with the wrench and just hold that nut still. So now we have our bump stops on the axle, and then the next thing I'm gonna do is install the coil spring. There's two things I wanna mention when you're installing these. There is a stop for this pigtail on the bottom right here on the axle. You're gonna make sure that that lines up, and of course that your isolator, your rubber isolator, is still up there in that tower. So we're just gonna slide this up and over, drop that down. Same thing for the other side. We're gonna start with that top, down and over, then you wanna line that up with that pigtail stop. Next, we're gonna lower our Jeep down a little bit, get those springs to seat, and then we'll get our shocks in. So the next thing we're gonna do, we're gonna work on getting these brake line brackets back in, because once we put this shock in, the shock bottom, we're not gonna be able to get these in. So we're just gonna go ahead, you're gonna have this little tiny tab on the one side. That's just gonna poke into that section on the inside, and we're gonna line that back up. We'll put that 10mm bolt back in. All right, so now that we got this bottom brake bracket in, what we're gonna do, we're gonna put our brake line extension brackets up here. You're gonna wanna free these lines up a little bit, as well as this ABS right here. And that way you can pull this down a little bit more. So what we're gonna do, we're actually gonna take out this factory bolt that I put back in there. Now you're gonna get these drop brackets. So reinstall this top bolt right here. Now as far as the bottom goes, you're gonna open up bag 1152, and this is going to be all of the hardware for the front and rear drop brackets. Now you're gonna get these little gold bolts. Each one of these is going to get a flat washer. What we're gonna do is we're just gonna go through this bracket, through the drop bracket, and then on the back side, we'll do a flat washer, another flat washer, and then a nylock nut. This is gonna be the same process for the other side, so we'll get this side done and tightened up, and we can do the same thing on the other side. So top's gonna be a 10mm. So we're gonna use an 11mm socket and an 11mm wrench to tighten up this bottom. Now one last thing that I like to do up here on these front brake lines, I like to bend this little 90° a little bit wider, and that's just gonna give you a little more drop in these lines so you don't rip them. Same thing goes for the other side. The first thing we're gonna do, we're gonna start off with that drop bracket. After that, we're gonna start with that top bolt, that factory bolt, and get that in. Next, we're going to install the shocks. The front shocks are very easy to install. We're going to get brand new hardware and bushings for the top. Now the rear shock is going to have a bar pin up top. This one's just going to have a stud for the front. And what you're going to do is you're going to put this cup washer. You want that to face upward. Next, you're going to install a bushing. Now this is going to have a raised edge. We want that to face up because we want it to go in this little slotted hole up there. Once you go up through, what we're going to do, we're going to drop another bushing down. Once again, that raised edge, we want it to face towards that hole. I'm going to shove both of those up in there, line them up over top of the hole, and then we want to poke our shock up through. Once we get that to poke through, we're going to put the brand new nut on that they give us. It's going to be tricky because of this battery box in here. But once you get that threaded, push it up a little bit and sit it in the bottom seat. That's going to hold it in place for me. And then I can use a 14mm wrench to tighten this nut up. So to make these pretty tight, you want a good amount of thread sticking up here on the stud, and you want to make sure that these bushings are compressed and that they're not loose in that hole. After we do that, we're going to go ahead and get the bottom of the shock installed. So for the bottom of the shock, we're going to reuse that factory bolt. You want to get that through, line up those holes, and we're going to use an 18mm socket and wrench to tighten it up. After you tighten it up, you want to torque it to 80 foot-pounds. So we'll go over to the other side, we'll do that same exact thing. Cup washer facing up, rubber bushing with that little ledge up top. We're gonna go up through. Of course, we have a lot more space on this side, so we don't have that battery tray. You're gonna make sure that you put that bushing facing down, same with the cup washer. Now to swap out our pitman arm, we're going to need to get to this nut, so we're going to have to remove our track bar fully. So right here at the frame side, we're going to need a 21mm socket and wrench to get this bolt out. Of course, you want to put that hardware aside because we're going to be reinstalling this. That way we can get the track bar out. Next thing we're going to do is remove that pitman arm. So we're going to take the nut off of the end of this pitman arm. You're going to need a 32 or 33mm socket. Once we get that nut and lock washer off, we'll have to get a pitman arm puller to get this arm off. All right, so we're gonna take our pitman arm puller, and what we're gonna do, we're gonna go up behind this, and that's gonna break it free. So we're ready to install our pitman arm. You're gonna see that right here on this shaft, you are gonna have flat spots. This thing's gonna line up. You just need to make sure that you put it on in the same exact spot. So ours was on facing like this. We're just gonna slide that up, get it started. Now one thing that you do wanna do, you wanna lube up these splines. So you can spray it with some WD-40, or if you have grease available, you can put that on there as well. That's just gonna allow it to easily, well, slide up the shaft more easily. So while we're here, we're going to reinstall our drag link. Basically, we're just going to pick that back up. We're going to put it back into the pitman arm. And what you want to do is you want to lube up these threads a little bit because it actually is going to be pretty tight. It's going to fight you and all of your efforts to get it back in, and the tie rod's just going to spin. So we're going to spray this a little bit just like that. And we'll get our 21mm wrench and we'll put that back up in. Now, if this does spin and you can't get it to sit still, what you can do is you can stick a 1/4-inch Allen key in the tip of that stud, and that's gonna hold it in place while you use a wrench to get that tight. The way that I like to do this is you stick your pry bar here right on top of that upper control arm or inside that differential mount right there, and you just press up real tight on that. We're gonna use that 21mm wrench to tighten up that nut. This should do a pretty good job of holding this in place for us. Like I said, if it doesn't want to stay in place for you, you can use a 1/4-inch Allen to hold that stud still while you do this. So after you're finished tightening this is going to get torqued to 77 foot-pounds, and this nut right here on the drop pitman arm, 185 foot-pounds. All right, so next thing we're going to do, we're going to get ready to install our track bar relocation bracket right here on the front end. We're going to need to get this bolt out here for our steering stabilizer. This is going to be an 18mm socket to get that out. There is a flag nut on the backside, so we don't need a tool for that. And since our bracket is going to go right here, I'm actually going to get rid of this pole jack. I'm going to use an 18mm on an extension to get this bolt out. So now that we got our steering stabilizer out of the way, we're going to install this track bar relocation bracket for the front. It's going to be this funky looking bracket just like this. You're going to see you have this little cutout. This is going to sit right on the axle. So what you're going to do is you're just going to slide this back end in just like that. And you can see all these holes are going to line up on the front, and that's going to sit flush against the axle. The first thing we're going to do, we're going to install that U-bolt. Now, as far as hardware goes, we're going to use the hardware out of bag 1609, bag 2. And like I said, we're going to start with that U-bolt. So now that we have this bracket in place from the backside, we're going to take that U-bolt they give us in the kit. We're going to place that through, and what we're going to do is install the 2 flange nuts that they give us on the front side. Now, we're not going to tighten this up right now. We're going to leave all of this hardware loose because we have a ton of other hardware to get installed. I'm just using a 14mm socket on an extension because it's really hard to get your fingers in there. All right, so the next bolt we're going to put in is going to be this hole right here. This is going to be that factory bolt for the track bar that we took out with that flag nut. So you want to make sure that you put that on the back side. Now inside of this, we're going to install this large sleeve that they give us that comes in the kit. So we want to slide that down into place. Once we get that in place, we can install this bolt all the way through. Once it goes out the back side, we'll put that flag nut back on. Same thing, we're going to leave this loose for now. So the next thing we are going to install is going to be this steering stabilizer relocation bracket. Now we're going to have these 2 holes up here on either side of that bolt that we just installed, and this bracket is going to fit over top just like that with this mounting plate up top. Now we're going to use the 3/8 by 1 1/4 inch bolts that they give us. Each one is going to get a flat washer, and they're going to go through these pre-drilled holes that are already there. And then on the back side, we're going to install a flange nut. So you want to get both of those bolts in. Same thing, washer on both bolts. And then on the back side, we'll try to get these flange nuts installed. So now that we got this bracket on, the next thing we're going to do, we're going to tighten up all this hardware. This includes this U-bolt back here, this big bolt here, and these 2 bolts right there. Now we do have one last hole on this bracket that we need to drill, and that's going to be behind here, but we're going to tighten up all this hardware first. That way that's going to set that in place, we can drill that hole. So the first thing we're going to do is take a 21mm socket. We're going to tighten up that big bolt. So to tighten up these 2 U-bolts, we're going to use a 14mm socket on an extension. Now when you're tightening these up, you want to try to make them as even as possible. So we're just going to go back and forth and tighten them up. Now these are going to be that same 14mm socket, and we're going to use a wrench on the back to hold the nut still. All right, so now that we reframed the camera, you can see exactly where this hole needs to be drilled. You're going to have a hole in this bracket, so all you have to do is take a 3/8 drill bit and then drill all the way through that bracket. So once again, we're going to use that same bolt that we used for the steering stabilizer relocation bracket, that 3/8 by 1 1/4. We're going to put a flat washer up against the bolt head, drop it down, and then a flange nut's going to go on the bottom. And we'll take that same 14mm socket and wrench and we'll tighten that down. So the next step is going to be for those of you that are utilizing and keeping this factory steering stabilizer. First thing that we're going to do is take our bracket and mark it. So we're going to mark it right here on our tie rod assembly. Now, there are different year ranges for 07 to 2010. You're going to use a 13mm wrench to loosen up all of the nuts on this bracket, and you are going to slide it over 1 1/4 inches. Now for 2011 models and up, you're going to use a 15mm socket to loosen up this nut, just like our JK has right here. And the whole purpose that we want to do, we want to get this steering stabilizer from the backside. We wanted to get it to sit up on top. That way we can bolt it to this bracket that we installed over here. So we made our mark. What we're going to do is we're going to loosen it up, and then we'll move it and then tighten it back down. So we're going to take our 15, we'll loosen up this nut. Our bracket is going to be loose. So what we want to do, we want to spin this around just like that. And now we want to slide it over 1.5 inches. Okay, so once we slide that over, what we're going to do So we want this straight up and down, just like it is on top of the tie rod, and we want to tighten that back up. So we'll take that same 15, we'll tighten it back up. Now, when you're tightening this up, you want to make sure that your tie rod is level. You can see that this is tilted down a little bit. So when we actually level it out and straighten it up, this is going to be faced back a little bit. So we want to move that just ever so slightly. So now that we have the other bracket set in place on the other end of the steering stabilizer for the tie rod, we're going to go ahead and attach this other end to this bracket that we installed. Now, as you can see, I can't get this bolt here. So what we're actually going to do, we're going to shift this whole steering linkage over to the passenger side, and that's going to free up that area. So all you have to do is just take the steering stabilizer, press it back in, we'll line it back up, and then we'll get this bolt up through there. We don't want the bolt to face down because it's actually going to hit the tie rod, and that's not something that we want to happen. So once again, we're reusing that factory bolt that we took out. Then we're going to take an 18mm socket and an 18mm wrench, and then we'll tighten it up. Now, one thing that I did forget to mention before we got the steering stabilizer in, that big track bar bolt that we put through that bracket, you want to torque that down to 125 foot-pounds. Now both this bracket that we attached to the tie rod and moved, as well as this factory bolt here on the end of the steering stabilizer, you want to torque both of those to 50 foot-pounds. So one of the last things we're going to do is reinstall this factory track bar. Now for the frame side, we're actually going to reuse that factory hardware. We have brand new hardware for the axle side. All right, so now we got to get our track bar in the axle. Now the problem is right now our axle is actually shifted over a little bit. So what you can do, you can wait until you get your wheels and tires back on, sit the Jeep on the ground, use the weight of the vehicle and the steering wheel to shift this axle over. That's going to line that hole up for you. However, I do not want to do that. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to put this in with the axle and the Jeep up in the air. So I'm going to use a ratchet strap, and the way that I'm going to do this, I'm actually going to hook onto the far side of the axle, and then of course the opposite side on the frame. So right underneath of here, there's a nice little spot that we can hook onto this bracket that we just installed. And what I'm going to do is just go up past everything and hook onto the frame. Now the one thing you want to keep in mind when doing this is it's going to be under a little bit of tension, so you want to be careful, wear safety gloves. And the next thing you want to make sure is that you're not hitting the track bar. The last thing we want to do is crank on this thing, shift the axle over, and then have it push on our track bar so we can't get it in the mount. And all we're going to do is just ratchet this so it shifts that frame over, and then we can knock our track bar into place and reinstall our brand new bolt. So the last piece of that kit is going to be this very large bolt here. We're going to put a flat washer on the end of that. Once you have that hole lined up, we're going to put that all the way out through the back side. We're going to do a flat washer, and then we're going to do this large nylock nut. After that, we're going to take a 22mm socket, and I'm going to take an adjustable, or if you have a 22mm wrench, you can put that on the back side. We'll go ahead and tighten this bolt up. All right, so after you get this bolt in, you want to torque that down to 125 foot-pounds, and the same thing goes for the frame side. You want to torque that other bolt, that factory bolt, to 125 foot-pounds. All right, guys, now the last thing we have to do on the front is install those sway bar end links. Now, the sway bar end links that we're going to use for the front are actually on the back. So we ran to the back real quick, and what we're going to do is just take these off, swap them out, and then put them on the front. Now for the top right here, you're going to need an 18mm socket or wrench, and we're actually going to hold this backside with a 19mm wrench. The bottom is just going to be 2/18, so we're just going to take these off real quick. So we're going to take that link back up to the front now that we have it removed, and we're going to install that tie rod stud up top with that factory nut. Now for the bottom, we're going to reuse that factory hardware that we pulled off of the front in the beginning of this installation. Once you get those in, we'll use those same exact tools to tighten them up. After you get this one in, you can do that same exact thing to get the other side installed. All right, guys, so now that we're done with the front, we're gonna move on to the back. Now, we do have one last thing that we need to do on the front, and that is torque all of those control arms. But we wanna do that when the vehicle's on the ground. That way we can torque those control arms and have those bushings in a relaxed state. So back here on the rear, same thing. We're gonna start off by supporting our axle with our pull jacks. First thing we're gonna start with is our track bar bolt down here where it meets the axle. We're gonna use a 21mm socket, and same thing, would be a good idea to take this out while it's on the ground, but I'm gonna do it in the air, and it's just gonna have a little bit of tension on it. Axle might shift over just a smidge. There's a flag nut on the back side, so you don't need a tool for that. Next, we're gonna disconnect our axle vent tube right here. All you have to do is just pull up in the air, it's gonna lift off. So next we're gonna go into our wheel well. We're gonna do two different things. We're gonna disconnect this ABS line where it pushes into our frame. We're also gonna take our brake line bracket off right here. That way we can get some length, we can lower this axle down. So you need a trim panel removal tool, screwdriver, anything you got. What we're gonna do is just pull that out of there. That's gonna give us plenty of length to drop this down. Then we'll take our 10mm socket, go ahead and get that factory bolt out. Then we'll go to the other side and do the same exact thing. All right, so next we're gonna go right above our axle on the bottom of our tub. You're gonna see these e-brake lines. They're gonna have this little hanger, coat hanger bracket thing. And what we wanna do is we wanna take this off. This is gonna give us more room for when we flex our suspension and of course put those taller springs in. You're not gonna bind this up or rip them at the axle. So we're gonna take a 10mm socket. We're gonna take these two nuts off of here. So next thing we're gonna do, we're gonna take out our shocks. So the bottom of the shocks, you're gonna have that bolt. We're gonna need an 18mm wrench and a socket to get that out. Go over to the other side and do that same exact thing. All right guys, so now that we have our shocks out, the next thing we're gonna do, we're gonna lower our axle down. That way we can free up those springs and get them out. All right, so now that we've got everything off of the back end, we're gonna start putting things back together with all this brand new stuff. Now the first thing we're gonna install is these coil correction plates and our coil springs. Now you're gonna see that these do have a slant to them. They're gonna have these little feet on the back side. And what we want these to do is tilt the springs forward. So we're actually gonna place these with those little feet towards the rear of the Jeep. And you wanna make sure that those sit down and lock in place. After you do that, you're gonna take your coil spring. The small end is gonna go on the bottom. So we're just gonna go ahead and tilt that up, and we wanna raise our axle up a little bit just to seat that in place. Same thing goes for the other side. We wanna make sure that that small winding is at the bottom, and then we have our plate on there. After that, we're gonna raise our axle up a little bit. All we're gonna do is just seat that on our isolator. So next thing we're gonna do, we're gonna install our rear bump stop. This is going to be this part right here. And you're gonna have two sets of holes actually. You're gonna be able to stand this up like that. That's gonna give you a little bit more height for taller tires. You can lay it down just like this. We're actually gonna install it just like this. As far as hardware goes, we're gonna use the hardware out of 1609 bag 6. It's gonna be these gold bolts that they give you. Each one is going to get a flat washer. What we're gonna do is just drop them down through these holes. And then on the bottom, they're gonna get these little flange nuts. So I'll go ahead and get both of these bolts installed, and then we'll tighten them up. So to tighten up this hardware, we're gonna use two 14mm wrenches. So you get that last bolt tight, you can do the same thing to the other side. All right guys, so the next thing we're gonna do, we're gonna install our rear track bar relocation bracket. This is gonna be this funky looking bracket like this. The way this is gonna work, you're gonna have this bolt hole here. This is actually gonna utilize this factory hole right here. And then we're gonna use these two holes over here. So the only thing we have to do, we do have to drill a hole on top of here, and that's gonna go right through the top of this. So what you wanna do is you wanna get your track bar out and around and up on top. And what we're gonna do is just lift this up, slide this bracket on, and then we'll get started. Now to get this in position so we can drill that hole, we want to set some of this hardware in place. We're going to be using the hardware out of 1609 bag 5. And we're going to take this large bolt that they give us, place a washer on it, and all we want to do is just get it through both of those mounts. All right, so we're going to get both of these bolts in over here on these control arm mounts. These are going to be this silver bolts that they give you. They're about 1 inch long. Each one is going to get a flat washer. We're going to go through both of these brackets. On the back side, we're going to install a flange nut. Since it's very hard to reach back there, I'm actually going to use a magnet so I can get all the way up in there and get this thing started. So after you get those two bolts installed, we're actually going to tighten them up because I want to pull this bracket close to this control arm, so when we drill this hole, we won't have any weird tension when we do go to tighten these bolts up. So you're going to need a 14mm wrench and a socket. So the next thing we're going to do, we're going to drill this top hole. It's going to be in here. You need a 13/32 drill bit. We're just going to come straight down from the top. You can see I moved the track bar out of the way a little bit. All we want to do is drill through that mount and then install that bolt. Next, we're going to take that gold bolt, 1 1/4 inch long, that comes in that kit, same bag, flat washer up top. What we're going to do is drop that down through the hole. Then we're going to put a flange nut on the bottom. We're going to take a 14mm wrench and a socket on an extension. We're going to tighten that bolt up. So we're going to take that new track bar bolt out. What we have is a sleeve to install. The sleeve is going to go on the inside of here, and that's just going to keep us from crushing this when we go to tighten this up. So we're going to take our sleeve, put it up into place, and then we'll just reinstall that bolt. Now on the back side, we're going to do another flat washer. We're also going to do a large nylock nut that they give us in the kit. Next, we're going to take a 22mm socket for the bolt head, and then we'll take our adjustable wrench for the nut side, and we want to tighten this up. All right, so the next we're going to do, we're going to pick our track bar up, and what we want to do is we want to install it in this middle hole. So we're going to use the same bolt that we used down here. These are going to be the same bolts, and same thing, we want a flat washer on the head of the bolt. We're going to go through flat washer and lock nut on the back side. All right, so what you're going to need to do, this hole is a little off center. This axle shifts pretty easily, so I'm going to get someone to just pull on the other side. They'll shift that over, I'll get this bolt in. So we'll put our flat washer and our nylock nut on there. So now that we got that bolt in, the same thing goes. we're gonna use that 22mm socket and an adjustable wrench to tighten that up. Now once you get both of these tight, what you want to do is put it on the ground. You want to torque both of those to 125 foot-pounds. So next we're going to install our rear shocks. Now we're going to reuse all of that factory hardware, and what I like to do is actually get one of these bolts started. Run that up a little bit, and what you can do is go ahead, get that bar pin up there, slide the one end on, and then you can get the other end in. After that, you can set the bottom of the shock in its bottom seat. We're going to grab that 16mm on an extension. We'll go ahead and tighten these up. So next you're going to line up that bottom. We're going to reinstall that factory bolt. Then we'll use an 18mm socket and wrench to tighten it up. Once you get these tight, you want to torque them to 56 foot-pounds, and those upper bolts that we installed, you want to torque them to 37 foot-pounds. All right, so then we'll go over to the other side. We'll do that same exact thing. So next we need to situate our differential vent tube hose. Now what you can do is you can go get a longer hose, or actually what I'm going to do is reroute this. So you see it's on the back side of this cross member for our frame. What I'm going to do is just push it up, go around to the other side and drop it down. That should give us a little bit more length. Now if you can't get enough length out of this, you may need to go to the other end and free it up from where it attaches to the body. We got enough length, so we're going to plug that in, and we're going to move on to the next step. Next we're going to install our brake line drop bracket. So we want to take that factory bolt, maybe screwed it back in, we want to take that back out. We're going to put our bracket in, screw that bolt back in, then we'll need to tighten that down with a 10mm. We're going to take that same hardware that we used on the front for these brake line drop brackets that come in that kit. Each one's going to get a flat washer. We're going to go through our brake line bracket. On the back side, we'll do another flat washer and a nylock nut. So we'll use a 10mm to tighten up the top bolt, an 11mm socket, and an 11mm wrench to tighten up the bottom. Now you want to make sure that after you do that, these lines are not rubbing the frame in any way, and that this is not going to hit the sway bar, because we don't want them to rub through. So we'll go over to the other side and we'll do that same exact thing. So next we're going to take care of this ABS line. We're going to get this first one in there. You can see that it's not going to stretch far enough to get that second one out, so we're actually going to leave that out. Give us a little bit of slack for when we articulate our suspension. All right guys, so the last thing we have to do on the rear of our Jeep is going to be to install this brand new sway bar end links from Rough Country. Now as far as hardware goes, you're going to use bag 1681, bag 3, and you're going to have sleeves. Now these sway bar end links, they have rubber bushings inside of them, but they don't have these metal sleeves. You'll need to press those in, and I would show you on the vise. However, we broke the vise in an earlier install, so I had to use other means to get these installed. What you're going to do is just spray some WD-40 on the inside of this bushing. These are going to slip right in. You can use that vise to press them in. We get brand new hardware to install these, so I'm going to show you how to do that right now. All right guys, so what we're going to do, we're going to install the sway bar end links on the outside of our sway bar and also on the outside of this mount down here. Now these new bolts that they give you, you're going to get 4 bolts total. That's going to be 2 for each sway bar end link. Each one is going to get a flat washer, and for this top one going through the sway bar, we're going to go through the outside towards the inside. We don't want this stud sticking out because it can contact our wheel. On the other side, we're going to do a flat washer and then a nylon lock nut. On the inside, we're gonna do another flat washer and then a nylock nut. So we're gonna go ahead and tighten up this side. You're gonna use a 19mm wrench and a 19mm socket to tighten it up. All right, once you get both of these in, you can torque them down to 75 foot-pounds. Then we'll go over to the other side and do that same exact thing. All right, so I'm gonna start with this bottom bolt. Push that through. Now, since we don't have that bracket on here, on our passenger side, we can put that washer on. We can put our nylock nut on. And then up top, we're gonna put that bolt back in. Same thing, washer on the head, washer on the opposite side, and then a nylock nut. And we'll go ahead and tighten it down. All right, guys, so looking up here at the front drive shaft, you can see exactly what I'm talking about. If you chose to opt out on those exhaust spacers, you can see that at a full droop, we can't get our drive shaft back in. This is because that crossover pipe is actually hitting that rubber boot on the drive shaft, and this is one of the reasons why you want those exhaust extensions if you are looking to fully flex your suspension. So all you need to do is at the very end, you put your wheels and tires back on, you drop that vehicle on the ground, that's gonna load that suspension, and you'll be able to get this drive shaft back in. Now you're gonna use a 15mm socket to get all 4 of those bolts back in. Remember, you wanna line up that mark that you made, and after you get all 4 of them in, you wanna torque them to 81 foot-pounds. Now the last thing you'll need to do is torque those control arms, both the upper and lowers for that front end, and the lowers are gonna get torqued to 125 foot-pounds and the uppers to 75. This is pretty tough to film and get it done on camera, so I actually crawled under there off camera and torqued all that stuff down. After you get all that done, the next thing you wanna do is take it for a test drive. Make sure you don't have any weird noises, nothing is rubbing. Then you wanna take it for an alignment. You'll have them adjust the toe, and of course, now they're gonna be able to adjust those control arms as well, dial that pinion angle in, and make sure that they recheck all of the torque on all of that hardware. However, that's gonna wrap up my review and install. For more videos and products like this, check us out at ExtremeTerrain.com.